Welcome to the Hindi Amp Studios podcast, How Creatives Think, episode number 1. We are super excited to be here with you guys. My name is Landon Hook.
I'm Chris Henderson.
And if you would like to know a little bit more about what Hindi Amp Studios is, who we are, what we do, there'll be links below down in the description to kind of explain all of that. But today, we're really excited to be with you today to launch episode number 1 of the new podcast, How Creatives Think.
Yep, it's going to be with Austin Hart. He is one of our really good friends that we've come to know in the industry. And this dude has literally done everything. You name it, he's done all of it.
All of it.
Successful studio manager, recording artist as Larange and Marlowe, mix engineer, producer. He's been a head at A&R Nashville Top Artists. He's been a creative director of Mellow Music Group, which did a ridiculous amount of stuff. We're talking digital distribution.
Forbes magazine literally named them the most successful indie rap new label in 2016. It's pretty insane.
It's ridiculous. Sync licensing, project manager, artist development, you name it, and he has been a part of it. Even featured in the Olympics, major video games, NBA 2K, Fortnite, etc. Like, the guy has just done so many things.
He's a voting member of the Recording Academy. This guy
we thought,
is everywhere.
you know what? This guy would be a great first person to talk to, because when you're thinking about creative people, this guy has been creative at every level of every single aspect of the world of creativity and music. And so we're really excited to present this to you guys.
Yeah, he's also a good friend of ours. We actually know him best through his work as CEO of his own music label, Old Soul Music. And Hindi Amp Studios is actually proud to be a part of that. And we're really excited for you to get to know him like we know him.
Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. We have Austin here, and he has become a really great friend of ours, and he is one of the more creative people that we know, and we thought starting off the podcast with him would be honestly the best way to do this. And so, Austin, welcome.
It's an honor. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on.
Okay, so the way we'd like to start, and we plan on starting like all of our podcasts this way, is we just want to get to know you a bit more, have our audience start to understand who is Austin, what is the history of Austin, and how has Austin gotten to the point of where he is today?
Sure. Yeah, no problem at all. I've had a relationship with just general sort of creativity since as long as I've been around. I think it is arguably the only thing I'm good at, and I don't think I'm especially good at any one craft. I've always loved writing and doing visual arts and music, and even approach to more analytical things. I think it has a lot of room for creativity and a lot of room to find creative solutions and problem solve with ways that sort of tap into that same part of your brain. And so, I went to school for creative writing, and I've since gotten pretty heavily involved with graphic design and visual arts. And I'm a musician and producer named Larange, and I've enjoyed painting and writing and all sorts of things, but they all kind of tap into the same part of my brain. I don't think I am especially good at any of those things in terms of the craft, but I do think that it's a nice way for me to tap into something that's very important in my life, which is just to approach life with that sort of openness to being creative.
It's an interesting thing that you just said, the idea of approaching life. In other words, you're suggesting that creativity has more to do with a lifestyle, like a person. I am just who I am, and that just happens to be described as creative. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think so, but it's something that I've more reverse engineered than it is a philosophy that I tried to lay out in front of me moving forward. When I look back at the things that I've interacted with, I'm more recognizing the pattern of how those things go. Like for a very long time in my life, I really wrestled with the concept of becoming a better musician until, I got a little older and I realized I just don't care, and And the truth is, I just want to make something interesting and something creative, and the thing that ties in all the different parts of my life is that same approach. I just want something that kind of evokes something, and how I get there doesn't really matter. Just getting good enough just to be able to put what's in my brain into the world is the only obstacle.
Can you walk us through your music, specifically the Laurent stuff? Like, you had a particular workflow. I remember when I visited you, and it was really cool to see kind of how you worked everything out.
Sure.
And what struck me was kind of a mad scientist approach, where you didn't really know the destination. You just had some ideas, and wherever it went was just as much of a surprise to you as it was to anybody else. And could you kind of walk us through that workflow and how that was a fulfilling or not fulfilling thing for you?
Sure. Yeah. No. As a hip hop producer, a lot of my influences come from the way that hip hop was created, which was from sampling different parts of music and sampling things from vinyl, and being able to interact with existing music in a way that could create something new from that. And it's a concept that's sort of difficult to explain, and difficult for people to understand, because it really does require your brain to sort of shift over into this mode of repurposing something in a way that doesn't reflect that thing directly. Most people's instinct when they sample is to loop the existing music, and then you kind of at the end realize that all you've done is just add some drums to the thing that was already there. And so in terms of the workflow, it's very much about adapting. So one of my core sort of philosophies is that I try to approach life as if there are infinite solutions to every problem. And whether or not that's true, it doesn't really matter. It's more making sure that that's your mindset, because it's too easy and frustrating to get locked into more binary choices, as if that's the only thing you have. And producing hip hop doesn't allow for that. You have to.
Did you see it? Sorry to interrupt. Did you see it as solutions to problems? In other words, were you trying to find a solution, like I need a kick beat that follows this pattern or something like that, or was it more exploratory?
Yeah, so it's less about the drum side of it, because the percussion of it is more rooted in the culture and the history of beat making, and it is more about the craft, because when you're doing drums in loops, like a hip hop producer, you're really, it's a game of milliseconds, because you're performing something one time in a way that will should be able to be repeated throughout it. And if you're not quantizing directly, then you need to be able to perform it correctly at least once, which sounds easy, but it really isn't. My mentor when I was coming up told me that if you create a good enough 4-bar loop, you shouldn't need to change it. And there are a lot of producers in the 90s, namely like Pete Rock is probably the best example of this, where Pete Rock would create a 4 to 8-bar loop, and then that would be the whole song. And then you would listen to it, and I sincerely doubt you would walk away from that song thinking, damn, that 8-bar loop just looped for 3 minutes. Because if it's a good enough loop, it'll continue to engage you. So in terms of problem solving, that is very much how I think of it, because the way I try to imagine it is that when I find a sample, I'm choosing that based off of my experience and what moves me creatively or emotionally. But when I have that sample, and when I'm trying to find it or find out how to turn it into something that I like, I'm trying to figure out what the answer to that problem is. I try to imagine that there is a good beat, or there is a beat that I would make in that sample. It's my job to find it.
So when you were making this music, I guess my question then is the beat something that you were trying to solve to facilitate a story that you wanted to tell? Or is the beat the end in and of itself that something goes on top that you figure out afterwards?
No, it's an interesting question, because when I was growing up in North Carolina, I was growing up in a time when hip hop production was very much about pop, electronic, more synth driven, early 2000s style hip hop production. And I never liked that. And I still don't like it. It's honestly my least favorite era of hip hop production. Even the people that were making music that was more in line with what I did enjoy wasn't making the kind of music that I wanted to make. And so I have hundreds, if not thousands, of beats from that era of me trying to do one or the other. And then the ones that ended up coming out from there are the ones that I ignored all of that. And I just did something that made me feel something. And so through that, two things happened. One is I think I found my voice as an artist. And when you're a sample based artist, that is not always the easiest thing to do. And two, no one in my hometown liked my music. Not a single, nobody.
Which hometown was this?
Wilmington, North Carolina.
Gotcha.
Great city for hip hop, surprisingly. Really amazing artists there. And it's nothing against the artists. They just didn't like my music. And a lot of them still don't, which is fine. But it wasn't until I left that I started feeling really confident about moving forward the way I wanted to move forward exclusively. There wasn't going to be compromise in terms of the stuff I wanted to make. And the stuff I wanted to make was breaking a lot of rules that I had learned, so figuring out what me making this beat sounds like is not the same thing as what this beat should sound like objectively.
I wanted to go back. You said something interesting about the sample-based culture with this music, and repurposing, I think is the word that you use, and finding your own identity and your own self and your own creativity in something that already exists, but that you can repurpose and put something new on top of and give it a new life. I wonder if that form of creativity in that space is very much different from your work as a visual artist as well. Because, I mean, a lot of the times, I guess you can start with something in the visual space, but a lot of times a visual space, you can also just start with a blank screen or a blank page. What have you found to be the key differences in being creative in those different types of spaces?
Totally. Yeah. No, not to 180 what you just said, but it's actually the exact same for me on these different spaces, because the way I think about creative writing, and when I was doing that, I was majoring in poetry. And the way I thought about poetry is that these words already exist. I'm just rearranging them, And so if I can find an order of these words that suits what I'm trying to communicate, that's my job, is to repurpose the language into a way that evokes something unique about my life or evokes something in the reader. Ideally both. And then with visual arts, it's very similar too, where I try to imagine that these things, I'm not an illustrator. And so I think if I was an illustrator or like a more traditional musician, I think those things would appeal more to the concept of creation from nothing. But, all of my philosophy on creativity has always come from problem solving. It's a way to think that the thing, the ingredients are there, and it's my job to put them in an order that communicates my intention and the feeling of what I'm trying to communicate. And even with painting, I mean, I don't know how much talent is involved in my painting. I just push paint around on a canvas until I feel something, and then I decide that it's done, And so at that point, like, I enjoy it quite a bit, but it's not as if I have a whole lot of intention with the painting until I see what I've done, and then I modify it and I move it in a way to make it what I want.
What style of painting do you usually make?
I'm sorry?
What style of painting do you usually make?
Whatever I'm throwing paint on a canvas with a paint knife would be called.
Okay, so usually like paint knife based?
Yeah, almost exclusively. I don't think I've ever used a brush.
I was the same way. I was
Yeah.
always a paint knife person, but it's interesting you're describing that, because when I was doing painting, it was the same kind of thing where I'm pushing paint around and I'm going to be as surprised as everybody else as to what ends up happening.
That's it. And
But
then once you start to see it, you start to flush out your intentions. And so it's a problem. It's a problem that you create, and then it's a solution that you create. And in that way, it is something unique. My wife, when I started painting, she came in and gave me the best compliment a wife could ever give, which is, it's really disappointing how good you are at this. And she goes, when was the last time you painted? And I said, I don't know, like elementary school. And she said, well, what are you doing here? Why do you feel like you know what you're doing? And I said, because it's the exact same thing as me doing anything else. It's no different. I'm not especially, like I said earlier, I'm not especially good at music. I'm not especially good at writing. I'm just tapping into the same part of my brain, and I'm just trying to apply that in different places. Like, I also, occasionally will do a crossword, and it feels not entirely dissimilar.
Okay, so let's take that same thought process. Your creativity comes out of problem solving. It has expressed itself from music. It's expressed itself with art, painting, etc. And now in business, which I guess it's been doing for you for a long time, but you've, with the distribution company and so forth. Can you walk us through what creativity looks like in what most people would be the mundane world of contracts and business and this and that? Because that's usually where people turn their brains off. They say, yeah, the creativity died. But I argue, and I think you are too, it doesn't die there. It actually infects everything that you do. And can you kind of walk us through that, how you see it played out?
Yeah, there's really nothing that precipitates my own creativity more than seeing people not apply creativity to a problem. When I see somebody do something wrong, or I mean, wrong to me, not the way I would do it, it becomes very clear immediately what I want to do, And so when I started working in the music industry about 14 maybe more years ago. And initially I got in for one reason, which was that I knew a lot of extremely talented and successful artists that were not making a living from music. And I wanted to try to advocate for those people. I wanted to turn talented musicians into working musicians. And then when I came in, like any job, it's about learning the rules, or any craft. It's about learning how to do the things, and learning how to adapt. And then over time, it just became really frustrating to me how many people in the music industry view things as, we either have to do one of these two things that is the industry standard. This is the way it's always been. Or we have to do something that is so completely different that it will obviously fail. Right. And so most people think in just those ways, right? Most of the time you're choosing between the two that exist, or the three, or whatever. And then, or you're coming up with this off the wall idea that kind of maybe is more in line with less creativity and more like Messiah complex kind of thing. And you sort of want to invent this thing that, and I always think that when you're doing creative problem solving, if I'm working with a sample and I'm struggling, the answer is not, let's just throw that beat out. Like, let's just get a new sample. The answer is, let's keep in mind that there are infinite solutions to this problem and figure out what it is. And so over time, it's gone, with more and more experience and more knowledge about the industry and different situations. I've gotten much faster at recognizing how to adapt and the ability to adapt. So because I know I think in those terms, and because I know this industry very well, it does put me in a unique position to, when I'm talking with an artist and the artist is asking these questions, I very quickly shift from these are the two options, these are what normally happens, to, okay, so how can we adapt? How can we do something that is not against the industry entirely, in a way that would require more work from you or would potentially hurt you, to let's use the system to your advantage in some way, or let's use this company to your advantage, right? Like, beyond something that would push us out of business, we are ultimately flexible because we're built to be that way. I approached the model for the business side with a creative sort of mindset, so that I could do that, so that when I'm making decisions, they're in line with artists, and that's not as like high-minded, idealistic as it sounds, because it is the way the company's built. If an artist is successful, and if I'm able to help them find advantage and find creative solutions and use systems that are deeply flawed and borderline predatory, if I'm able to help them use those to their advantage, then that is good for me too. So
You said something really important, I think. You used the word flexibility. In other words, we're flexible. And it got me thinking about the fact that it's kind of like, as a human, you start off your life more flexible than you'll ever be again in your life. And as you get older, you almost can predict a person's age based upon their flexibility, right? Once you get really, really old, you're not flexible. You're rigid in a sense. And you described something that I think is extremely important, and that is this idea of flexibility and creativity being in many ways very similar, like almost identical to a certain degree, because like you said, there's at least an infinite number of answers to every problem, right? Okay, so in your music, intense flexibility led you to your creative conclusions. Same thing with painting, and it sounds like you're describing that with your business. Does that kind of ring a chord with you, or no pun intended?
Oh, yeah, absolutely it does. I mean, that is very much there. A lot of the conversations that become the most frustrating for me are the ones where I am being told that you only have a set number of options, and I'm there are so many times in life that if you know the situation you're in, if you're confident about who you are and where you are, you can just kind of make it up. I mean, like, there are really if you know the rules, it's not that you break them, it's that you can just be creative and make up the thing that follows those rules. Whether it's a contract, in ways that, like, you don't want to make an artist, contracts are extremely important because they're actually protecting the artist too, right? And so a lot of places will go into this idea of they don't want to formalize agreements because it puts artists in a position to have to be vulnerable. But really, it's for the artist protection too. So when you go into that and you look at the contracts, and you're able to be flexible with the way you phrase things or the way that you position yourself in those contracts, if you know what the rules are and you're able to bend around and be flexible, then you're able to approach something with a way that will accommodate the human beings you're working with as well.
There's been an interesting thread, I feel like, from the beginning of our conversation all the way through, of kind of expanding this idea of what creativity actually is. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word creativity, they think like, oh, a photographer, a musical artist, a graphic
I would never
designer.
think of a photographer.
Landon does. It's
fair.
okay.
It's okay. It's okay. No, but I feel like this whole conversation has taken the view that I would argue most people have of what a creative is or what creativity is, and expand that to creativity can simply be defined as problem solving in a given situation, which, if that is how you view creativity, creativity can be applied to so many different facets of living as a human. I know that as creatives, sometimes we get more out of certain aspects of creativity. And I know that being an artist like Larange is a different form of creativity in some aspects than just being a label executive or anything else. I know that problem solving is the common thread, but I would like to hear your thoughts on, do you feel like you get something different as a creative out of your work as an artist opposed to your work as CEO of Old Soul Music, or are they really combined that much, or is there some separation for you in that?
Well, so I do think this slight distinction between problem solving as a general I think that there is a way to approach problem solving as it intersects with creativity. I think that that is my favorite type of the way people think. I think it's the way that I pride myself on making sure that I'm vigilant about continuing to think in those ways. But I also know some pretty incredible accountants are amazing problem solvers. I wouldn't describe all of them as creative, but some
Right.
are, you know. But when it comes to the differentiation between the fulfillment or the result of something like my music versus my work with Old Soul Music, they could not be more different in terms of the results. The process I like to align as much as possible because it's just what I'm good at. And if I do what I'm good at with artists, it helps artists. And so but the result is incredibly different. The process is really nice to scratch that creative itch in both places, but the result is very different because it's important to me that when I work on the business side, the art is not about me. It's not. I have plenty of places to get validated creatively or to feel good about myself in terms of my own creativity. I could just go paint a thing that no one will ever see, and that feels good to me. But when it comes to the business side, the process is supposed to be creative. The result is I am supposed to be hidden, basically. The only ways I'm not hidden are ways that I am trying to add value to artists. I desperately, desperately do not want to affect the creativity of any artist I work with because I'm out of the same respect for my process. I want to have that, mirror that with artists I work with.
Right. That makes sense.
One of the things, jumping back into the creativity process, specifically in artistic expression, one of the things that Landon and I used to do when we were doing a lot of recording and so forth, is that we would have...
I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, we would have Wednesday nights, and Wednesday nights were all right, we're going to go crazy. We're going to bring in some random friends. And I remember one of the most creative things that we ever did, I still look back and say, man, that is some of the... Like, I could not recreate that if I tried. I tuned a guitar to open C tuning, but kind of a funky version of it. And I told all the artists who had never played in this particular tuning, everything we write tonight has to be a song and it has to be in this tuning. And it was one of those things where, like you were saying, problem solving. Here's your problem. We have inherently limited what you're able to do. And now you think that that is a limitation to your creativity, but the creativity that happened that particular night was greater than anything we had done if we had been open-ended with, well, we could do anything. It's almost like paralyzing. I mean, I'm curious to know if you have a parallel with that.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. It's one of my core philosophies is that, options precipitate comfort and limitations precipitate creativity. In that way, it does all overlap with problem solving. If you don't have limitations, you don't have a problem to solve. And I don't do well in that environment. And it's not the same as sort of a blank page syndrome, because if I am writing something from scratch, I will write something from scratch, and then I will go back and I will solve the problem that I just created. So it's positioning myself to play to my strengths is sort of how I developed my own process.
Well, I think we even see that in like writing a film score, for example. Like we'll start with this initial melody or this initial progression, but then once you get into the weeds of what that song becomes and grows into, there are problems that come up because of the progression you wrote or because of the melody you wrote. And that doesn't inherently mean that melody or progression is incorrect or wrong. It just simply means that now you have something to solve based on what you started with. And I would argue, and I think we would all agree, that I think some of the most beautiful things can come out of trying to solve a problem in that situation, such as, how does this melody work over this progression? How do I fit a melody over this progression? Like it allows you so much. It's weird because I feel like inherently the limitations that come out of those situations are almost freeing to your inner creativity instead of just having endless possibilities, you know?
Yeah, I can't operate within those possibilities. It just doesn't work. It's also difficult for me to collaborate with some people because of that. Because a lot of musicians I do know, real musicians, let's call them, as opposed to what I do, is uh, they come to things with a concept of creation in a different way that I do. Just because I'm sort of manipulating things that exist doesn't mean it's not creation. It means that I have to create something that I then manipulate. It's more about the process. But when it comes to sort of completely open ended things, yeah, no, it would definitely be something that I don't think I would excel in if I didn't wasn't able to go through it the way that my process works.
Does the limitation or do the limitations allow us to be more creative partly because it's freeing in the sense of it's almost like you got a cop out, like I'm going to expose a portion of what I really want to do, but I feel like I can hide behind, well, I had the limitations, so I had no other choice.
Well, so not to get overly, sort of philosophical with this, but if we're trying to say that the result of creativity is to reflect humanity, then I can't think of anything more human than interacting with a limitation, whether it's through the history of humanity or on a day to day life, is to be able to face a limitation and find a solution to it. And so, in that way, you are reflecting humanity more accurately than you ever could.
Well, then I think we see that in the fact that limitations can often display themselves in our lives as major events, as painful events, even in life, as we see things that we are unable to do or unable to solve. And I think we see that in a lot of artists who come out with their first record, where they
Mm.
have an entire lifetime of of trauma, of pain, of limitations on their life, and they get it all out in this album. That is like, this is my story of what I've had to go through. And then if that album gets any acclaim or anything like that, a lot of times, I mean, there's the saying, because there's a saying because it's very true, is the sequel is almost never as good as the original. It's just it rarely is. And do you think that's because when you get to the part of creating the sequel or the second record, that a lot of the limitations from that first experience have been lifted?
I mean, yeah, I do. I mean, I think that happens in an awful lot. I think the first time you're not. I also think that it's very, very difficult to create. Most everything in the world is just a reaction to something else, right? And so the first time when you're making an album, whether it's your opus or whether it's something that you regret, you're making it reacting to yourself exclusively. There's nothing else really, or maybe your circumstance. Um, but then when you make something, the second time you go back, you are factoring in, the way people perceived your first album, especially if it was successful. And so there is some of that for sure. One thing I see a lot is that artists think that every song needs to be their entire life.
Mm.
And in my experience, a piece of art should just be one thing. Um, and so if you know what that thing is, it's going to be a lot easier to communicate it. And so artists do put a lot of pressure on themselves with their sophomore albums for that reason too, is because they think, first of all, why did people like that first one? Oh, it must be because of this, and they're always wrong. You know, and then or they think this is now this album needs to be this or that. It needs to be more ambitious. It needs to be more this or more that. But even by thinking more anything, you're reacting to yourself, and you never want to become a fan of yourself. And when I say a fan, I mean not just loving it, but also reacting to it in any way. Like fans hate music all the time. Sometimes if you're reacting to your own music, then you are acting as a fan. You're not acting as a person who's creating.
So is it better to ignore what anybody says or thinks about your creation? And if you
That's
don't
process.
ignore, then you end up losing the creativity as a result?
I mean, I think you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. So it's sort of one of these. It's sort of one of these things where it's very difficult to say what you should do in that situation. It's more about how you manage the situation, and
Well, I
a
mean
lot of
more
that.
along the lines. I mean more along the lines of staying creative. So in other words,
No,
you've
no, no. I
stayed
know.
creative for a number of years. Like, what's the secret? Do you think for you in that sense?
Well, so what I was saying is I think that it ends up coming down to something less about creative process and more about your chemistry and more about how you act when you encounter emotional problems throughout your day, or how you deal with conflict, or it ends up interacting with a lot of the way you handle interpersonal communication or disappointment or these kind of things. So it's hard to write a prescription for that because some people really don't have an issue interacting with the reviews. For instance, I very seldom will ever have a strong reaction to a review. I'm pretty okay reading them because I'm very confident in what I wanted. So it's really just about whether or not they understood, or that I've even reached out to a particularly insightful reviewer who, in my opinion, reviews music a little too intellectually when it comes to my stuff, but he had some really interesting thoughts from that perspective, and I was really curious about elaborating, and so I reached out to him with the kind of intention to be like, look, I'm not trying to call you out on this. I'm not trying to confront this. I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I just really would like to hear more about what you meant there, because it feels like that's a valuable outside perspective for me. Some people, I would never recommend that for in a million years, because interacting with that in any way is going to be bad for you.
What would be some words of advice that you would give to people, whether they be in the music or the artistic, like painting, the visual arts industries or whatever else, up and coming people that are they're still bright eyed, they don't know what they don't know, but man, they're really excited about it. What would be some pieces of advice? I realize this is steering a little bit away from the creativity side of things, but I think it could be incorporated with it. For those types of people, what would you advise as far as how to have a lifelong fulfilling creative career in these types of industries?
Well, the career part makes that slightly more complicated question, but my advice to people who want to have a lifelong fulfilling relationship with creativity is to try to pay attention to your own chemicals. So when people are trying to find their style or their approach or their voice, a lot of people are mixing in a lot of things. They're conflating a lot of influences that, in my opinion, don't belong. So what is good? What will my friend like? What would my hero like? What would somebody like this on the radio? Would somebody want to see this in a museum? Those are all things that are kind of irrelevant, because the people that really find fulfilling relationships with their art, in my opinion, are people who try to pay more attention to what they like, because it's not as obvious as it would seem. Because if you are creating your own voice and you want it to be fulfilling, you're really going to be imitating the people you love. And my theory is that you imitate the people that you love, and when you realize how absolutely incapable you are of imitating those people, whatever is left is your style.
Mm.
And so if I'm going to come in and try to become Kanye West on my first beat, and then I keep going back to that well for a year because I don't know how else to do it, I'm going to end up with about 100 beats that are all terrible. But it's important to go, what do these beats have in common? Like, obviously it's not Kanye West. So what is it? What do I do? Pay attention to your own music as if you are like treating yourself, like taking care of yourself rather than putting yourself into a box that doesn't already exist.
Well, on that note, I know that creativity and having a lifelong good relationship with it, there's nothing in life that's going to be lifelong that's not going to involve disappointment and bumps in the road. How would you, and how maybe have you approached obstacles and disappointments as a creative? Because I know as creatives, when we put something out in the world, as much as it should be just for us, we created it just because we wanted to, or maybe we couldn't not create it. There is always a little bit of that. I want other people to like this too. For, I would argue, most creatives, but sometimes you don't get that. How do you navigate how the world perceives your art and receives your art?
Well, there are a lot of different ways. I mean, it's sort of a complicated um, uh, question because there's a lot of different caveats to it. I think first and foremost, you try to envision these creative obstacles as just things that are happening, as opposed to disappointments. They're just, the only times that you would be disappointed is if you had set expectations for yourself that you didn't meet. And I don't know if art is really the place to do that.
Mm.
Um, and so when it comes to, the actual effect of your music, something I try to share with artists, but I don't know how well received this concept is, but it's always been important to me, is that, like, when we talk about changing the world, we tend to think of in terms of, Edison and Einstein and Da Vinci, but really every human that's ever, like, pulled a blade of grass from the yard to see what it looks like up close has changed the world. I mean, like, you don't have to be overly, you don't have to touch every human in the history and the future of society to have made an impact. It almost bothers me when I see people that have maybe 100 monthly listeners, and they are talking about themselves as if they failed. And I understand ambition, but to me, you have to set aside ambition from why you're doing this. Do you want to do this to resonate with people, to show them something about yourself, or because you have something to say, or because you have to? And none of those things come with any expectation, or they shouldn't really. So appreciating that by having created something, you have changed the world in some way is really important to me, just from I guess, a more sort of esoteric philosophical standpoint. But I also think it's a really important way to maintain your mentality.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying essentially is this. If what you produce is never going to be seen by anybody, and if what you produce is going to literally be seen and loved by everybody, are those two things the same? If they are, then you're being creative.
So my very first album was an album called The Mad Writer, and that name was also used for the documentary about me, for some of my for that story. But the concept of that album, the concept of my very first album, was it was a story about a guy who leaves his family one day, rents a room, and starts typing on this endless scroll of paper, and just never stops. And so the idea being, what's the relationship between art, the artist, and the audience, and to what extent does that art have value if it never leaves your where you are? And it's interesting you phrase it that way, because that's exactly the concept that I was trying to ponder in that album. And I think about that a lot, because it's important for me, as somebody who was living that life a little bit, who was making thousands of beats that people have never heard, and you know I having poems and on post-it notes sort of plastered on my walls and shit. Like, it's important to me that that has value, and that doesn't mean monetarily or financially or in any way other than just, I had to do this, and so I did it.
I think sometimes, not sometimes, I think a lot of the time it harkens back to this idea of honesty in your art, and is such I created this because I couldn't not create this.
Mm.
And no matter how it's received by other people, that doesn't matter. I created it for me. I created it because I needed to get this out, and that is all the value that it ever needs to have. Anything after that is extra, is irrelevant to why this exists in the first place.
And I mean, that's very much my philosophy when it comes to my business as well. That's why I hold, an artist's process so sacred, and why I consider the transition of their art into the world as something sacrosanct that I'm not going to affect, in any way. I want to make sure that I move the river in a direction that will have people hear it more if I can, because that will have an end result of helping them. But when it comes to the art itself, I try to have as few opinions as I can,
That's very cool. So what's in the future for you, sir?
Well, as somebody who started a small business and we're approaching our first year, I mean, I think there are pretty dramatic forks in that road, And so I think hopefully I'll still be able to keep paying my mortgage, or hopefully this company will do incredible and will help thousands of artists. But right now it's a tough one to call. But in terms of what, for me personally, I mean, to echo our conversation, I whether or not, we're talking about how to navigate some social situation in my house, or whether we're talking about how to approach a painting, or get back into writing more poetry, or I love writing jokes. I have no ambition there. That's not something I care about, but I love doing it because it's problem solving. It's just creative problem solving. I love that you can say something one way that will not be funny at all, and then and all of a sudden it's funny. That's amazing. And so it's like a hobby, and so I can't not fill my life up with it, and everything I want is nearby when it comes to that. So, for my future, I don't know. Maybe I'm homeless. Maybe I'm a billionaire. I'll be doing the same thing.
That's so true. I may be homeless. I may be rich. It doesn't matter, because I'm still going to be doing the same thing, because I'm literally consumed by this.
That's my mom used to have a great line where she used to tell me when I was a kid. She said, I do not care if you are homeless, as long as you are happy. Just try to use your powers for good.
All right, Superman.
Yeah.
I don't think that's something you tell Superman. I think that's something you tell Lex Luthor.
What do you tell Superman? Please don't blow up the world.
Yeah, I think that's an appeal to the humanity that you wouldn't need to tell Superman.
Well, that was a creative response to my comment.
Indeed.
Very cool. We appreciate so much your time. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I apologize for going the philosophical route, but that's just how my brain works. And it's such an interesting topic to explore, because it seems unending, but yet, like you've been referring to, there's just such a thread of humanity that goes through everything, and it's almost like discovering what makes us us.
That's where I would prefer to go with the conversation. So no need to apologize. I'm very, very glad you guys brought me on, and it's always nice to talk with you guys, and I'm happy to come back anytime you want me to.
Thank you so much.
Well, we appreciate you, man.